Good morning, good afternoon almost, everyone. I want to begin by thanking the Urban Studies Foundation for giving me this extraordinary opportunity, particularly Chris and Ruth for setting up this event, and also a big thanks to Andy Pratt, my mentor, for his continuous support. So in this presentation, I will be talking about creative cities. In less than 1 second, Google finds over 260 million results containing this trendy term. And this creative cities phenomenon seems to be accompanied by all kinds of images, such as creative, iconic infrastructure in a city like Sydney or Bilbao, to forms of innovative transport systems in Medellin in Colombia, to street graffiti in Lisbon in Portugal. When I first heard the term creative city, the image that came to my mind was that of a sort of a large-scale theme park, a city of play, entertainment, adrenaline. But there was something that bothered me about the term. Are not all cities creative? What does it take for a city to self-proclaim this creative edge, creative nature? And also, which city would dare to say that they are not creative? So no doubt this is a very problematic concept, yet one that is being increasingly used by policymakers across the globe. But not only policymakers, but also industry organizations, international organizations such as UNESCO, UNCTAD, private consultancies, and scholars like me or Andy. So the creative city has now become a widespread urban development strategy that is shaping contemporary urban discourses. So let me now begin by telling you a story. This is Factory Berin. It used to be a chocolate and sweet factory located in Santo Cristo in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, in the port area. And the factory closed down in 1934. Sorry, it opened in 1934 and closed down in 2003 due to economic problems. Soon after that, artists began to move into the building and to rent informally, but then they started to rent the space to the family owners, the Familia Barreto. And the family owners had a large tax debt with the federal state, which led the factory to being sold at an auction, at a legal auction. So basically, the state government ended up selling the factory to a real estate company. The artist tenants were unaware of this process, this operation, so they received eviction notes. They had to vacate the factory in 30 days, a factory that had become their workspace. So they organized a Save the Arts Factory campaign, which surprisingly led to the city mayor, Eduardo Paez, to issue publicly a decree by including this factory into the city's heritage. So now the factory is protected in view of its architectural value and what has been described as its importance to this new area, new port area. So why am I telling you this story? Well, to tell a long story short, today Berin has become one of the largest arts production centers in Rio, providing workspaces to over 70 artists and 20 small creative enterprises. Yet it has also become a key cultural component of the large-scale urban development operations in Rio de Janeiro's port area, and also part of its branding as a creative district, as a creative city. Especially this happens in the context of the last year's World Cup, which took place also in Rio, as well as other Brazilian cities, and particularly in the context of the upcoming Olympic Games next year. So I think this story opens up a number of analytical dimensions that I want to share with you here to start. The first one is the central role of culture in the material transformation of the city, but also in its symbolic branding as a creative city. We also have the tensions and the disconnect between policy and practice, which become apparent in this little story. And finally, the rise of creativity as a policy object, as well as a powerful rhetoric, entwined with urban regeneration and gentrification in the global south. And I think these are concerns which are central to urban studies today. So in this context, I want to ask, what is a creative city and how is it imagined, planned, and contested in a Latin American context? And also think of why ourselves as urban scholars, we need to pay attention to this phenomenon. So in the next 50 minutes, I hope you keep awake, and I'll be trying to provide you with some answers to these questions, as well as to provide you an outline of my overall project, which is entitled Informal Creative Cities, Connecting Urban Cultural Policy with Grassroots Interventions in Latin America. So I've divided my presentation into three main parts. The first one deals with theory and concepts. The second one deals with methods and methodology. I'll be talking about research design, data collection, fieldwork. And finally, I want to share some of my preliminary findings with you and hopefully invite you to provide me with some feedback on how can I turn my questions further. I'm going to do a second round of fieldwork later in this year, so this is going to really be helpful. Before I start with part one, I just want to make a clarification here, is that I think that it's necessary to start a discussion about creative cities, not defining them, not providing you with a priori definition of it, but rather to explore how social actors in the field are using this term and what kind of social functions this category performs. And this has become one of the main components of my object of study, to actually find out in the ground, in view of social actors' views and interests, what the hell is a creative city. So my aim here is to develop a conceptual framework for understanding creative cities beyond northern views, which more often than not reduce urban creativity to the city's creative market economy. And this fails to engage with the dimension of informality, which is a key component of the cultural and the creative sector, particularly in the Global South. So I seek to examine alternative ways of understanding culture and creativity, specifically in context of urban segregation, social inequality, poor quality public spaces, and growing informal settlements. So where does this idea of the creative city come from? Creative cities is both a theoretical concept, but it's also an area of policy making. As a theoretical concept, we could trace back the origin to the 1980s with the growing interest in the economic value of culture, the rise of the cultural economy, and the integration of culture and the arts into urban planning, particularly in the UK, the US, and Australia. So discussion on the cultural economy was sustained by the mass production of the cultural industries, which then came to be labelled as the creative industries, a concept first deployed by the New Labour government in the UK in 1997, which began to demarcate this creative cities area of policy making. During the 90s, we have initiatives such as the European Capital of Culture, the publication of key works such as those of Charles Landry, Franco Bianchini, which began to explore the relationship between culture, creativity, and the spatial agglomeration imposed for these European economies, advocating for the importance of fostering creativity in cities. The 2000s witnessed an explosion of interest on the question of urban creativity, sparked by the work of Richard Florida, which might ring a bell to you, on the rise of the creative class, which was received both by criticism from scholars and great enthusiasm from policymakers. So Florida's model was based on the idea of the creative class as a magnet that would attract people to live and stay in the city, stressing the city as a place for mainly consumption. So creative cities are also an area of policy making, and here culture and creativity appear as a remedy for cities suffering post-industrial decline. We could think of a wide range of policy initiatives that illustrate this creative city phenomenon, from festivals, incubation programs, and the creation of specific art districts, creative districts, to urban marketing strategies, creative networks, and cultural-led regeneration, among many others. As an example of this, on a global scale, we have UNESCO's Creative Cities Network, which can be seen really as a milestone in the creative city field. And this is a network basically based on international cooperation, and it invites cities, it nominates cities as creative, following the submission of each city, a proposal on why they need to be seen as creative. And basically they foster the creation of partnerships and cooperation across cities. So there are certainly multiple definitions of creative cities. I think what is important to mention here is that creative cities go beyond a simple rhetorical operation to actually inform and shape actual policies. So we have views on the creative cities that stress them as a means for placemaking and living, but also this idea of the creative city as a place where there's a creative class living and working there. There's also this idea of adjusting to changes, so the creative city as a place that is resilient, that can quickly adapt creatively to changes in the global economy, for instance. And then we have other views that actually reminds us of the importance of production in the city. So cultural and creative production is equally important as consumption. And finally, the view of UNESCO that sees mainly as a cluster, as a creative hub and a socio-cultural cluster, both in the developing world and in the developed world, as they call it. So we could identify sort of a creative turn within urban policy and within urban studies as well. And this is certainly more than a policy rhetoric. And here I've just listed a number of examples that really illustrate these multiple interests that have emerged surrounding the creative city phenomenon. So here we can see how Latin America is turning creative as well. We have initiatives in Colombia, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Chile, in Uruguay, Mexico. They're all talking about creativity. So what is missing from these policy and academic accounts of the creative city? I want to argue that what is missing is mainly the dimension of informality. We can see that the creative city theory produced in the global north has difficulties in finding a space for informality. And I think this presents us with at least two main problems. The first one is that informality is present in the masses of low-wage, low-skilled workers employed by the new economy industries. Informality also shapes the myriad informal networks and connections that creative workers, mainly young people, used to get actual jobs. And also their precarious working conditions where freelance, inflexibility and instability prevail. So this is really a problem. We need to look at informality as a key feature of the cultural and the creative sector. And secondly, I think it's also a problem because more often than not, northern models get to be exported to the south, showing poorer cities that this is sort of an exemplary pathway to developing creative cities. So while the concern with informal culture is becoming an area of growing policy interest in the north, informality shapes the culture and the creative sector in Latin America, Asia and African cities, as well as other aspects of their urban life. So what is informality? Informality relates to many dimensions of social life, from housing, architecture, transport, as many of you may know, working in some of these areas, to also the workings of the state and civil society organizations. Informality is certainly a contested concept, which has been differently defined across disciplines. We could think of informality as a way of life, sort of the Ananya Roy's work. We could think of informality as a specific relationship with the state, which stresses the idea of the failure of formal institutions such as the state. We could also think of informality as a sort of derogatory category, mainly used by architects, describing lack of architectural form. And finally, as a sector of the economy. And this is the most traditional view of informality that mainly emerged throughout the 70s and 80s from Latin America, actually. So researchers looking at the different activities and people related to the informal market. So that employment sector made up of migrants back in the 70s, which ended up giving rise to the dichotomy between formal and informal. But today, in times of rapid urbanization, there has been recently a revival of studies and policy interest on informal processes in the city, which stress the need to move beyond the formal-informal dichotomy and to rethink informality as a trend and also as an organizing logic that shapes the very fabric of contemporary urban life. I think these three questions are important because they contribute to fill a knowledge gap about an unexplored area of research. But they also reclaim the role of culture in the city, so culture and the arts in shaping the city's creativity beyond economy-oriented approaches. I think they also challenge the prevalence of northern urban theory to explain southern cultural urbanism. And finally, I think they're also important because they help us to put in dialogue formal policy with informal practices, which, as you will see later, is a quite challenging task. I think these questions also pose a number of implications for the future of urban studies that speak to the relationship between the location of units of analysis in cities like Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires in Argentina, and the geography of knowledge, particularly a geography of creativity. So in a context of increasing neoliberalization of urban policies, with privatization, marketization, and gentrification at their core, I think that engaging with the grassroots, with the non-commercial, the everyday dimension of the lived experiences, can actually help us to think of alternatives to an hegemonic political economy of creativity. I think this also has implications for policy and activism, opening up the field of creative city policy to a much wider range of options, how to plan, how to develop, how to imagine creative cities. So I'm going to now move to the second part of this presentation, which is about methods and methodology. So I'm using, for this project, an exploratory design, as I said, as I'm dealing with an unknown area of inquiry that is the emerging field of creative cities in Latin America, and how it relates to existing cultural formal policies and informal cultural practices in the sector. So I'm grounding this investigation into these two cities, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and Buenos Aires in Argentina. And I've chose these cities because I think that they're responding to international trends in very creative ways. And I was also interested in looking at how they are facing global challenges in the cultural policy sector. Of course, if you have been to these cities or if you know something about them, you will know that they have many similarities and differences. They are current or former capital cities, they are wealthy and unequal at the same time, they have become global tourist destinations, and even UNESCO designated cities, both of them. But both cities are undergoing rapid urban change, driven by neoliberal urban governance agendas. I've already mentioned some of the urban operations in Rio's port area, triggered by mega sports events. And in the case of Buenos Aires, these policies have also been oriented towards physical beautification of its neglected south, aimed mainly at middle-class consumption, foreign real estate capital investment, and international tourism. And this is not a really unusual story. These policies have been accompanied by eviction of poor families and also with social protests. So the main thing I want to stress is that these cities, if we look at their histories, political context, and institutional frameworks, are diverse enough to unsettle an apparent homogeneous connection implied in the very category Global South, for instance. I'm here using a qualitative research strategy, as I'm interested in tracing, describing, and interpreting the worlds of meanings that make up the urban imaginaries about creative cities, in relation to views and practices on culture, creativity, and urban space. So I look at the cities through the lenses of the cultural and the creative sector, drawing on academic debates from urban studies, geography, architecture, and sociology, both from the north and from the south. So my aim here is to conduct a sociological analysis of the creative city that pays attention to three main things. One is power relations. I'm looking at relations between state, market, international organizations, and also grassroots cultural groups, which present resistance to many of these hegemonic connections. A second element I think is really important for my approach is looking at north-south post-colonial dynamics, which tend to be overlooked in creative city debates. And finally, the contentious nature of urban cultural planning and creative economy discourses, so the conflicts and the politics surrounding urban policy, city making, urban regeneration, and branding. I think that what makes this approach original is that, first of all, it brings together these two distinct bodies of literature. Secondly, it conducts comparative empirical research on Latin American cities. And thirdly, it links formal policy with informal practices in the cultural and creative sector. These might sound as pretty basic, obvious features, but these are features that tend to be overlooked, neglected, and invisible in many accounts of creative city. So, thinking of methodology, I'm trying to develop a form of comparative urbanism through my research projects. And in recent years, there have been calls to develop forms of comparative urbanism, and this has emerged as a powerful rhetoric in urban studies. But it can be practically challenging to actually compare the experiences of different cities, to write across different urban contexts, selecting units of analysis that reflect the transnational connections among cities, but also paying attention to their particular contingent geopolitical configurations. So there has been a call to provincialize urban studies, re-theorizing cities of the South, thinking back from elsewhere, mainly off-the-map cities, as Shani Robinson has put it. And this is an issue that haunted us all at the recent AAG conference in Chicago, where there was a call for problematizing what it actually means to think from the South, and how this might impact the work of scholars in the global North, and whether are we, as scholars working in the global North, ready to face the likely consequences of a shift in urban studies literature. So in this sense, I seek to produce knowledge that is situated in specific cities, looking at South-to-South dialogues, but also in relation to existing Northern urban theory, namely that of creative cities. And this involves, I think, a consideration of North-South dynamics, especially when urban planning decisions emerge from countries in the North that might have been the colonial masters of countries in the South. So what to compare? What do I want to compare? So I'm comparing two city case studies here. The creative city field in Rio de Janeiro with that of the Buenos Aires. And I'm doing it through a number of cases, as I will explain later on. So to tell you a bit about my case studies, I have selected a number of case studies to gain insight into the alternative practices and formulations of policy and action. That is, not only looking at the type of creative city policies, but mainly engaging with actual contestations to top-down policy inspired in the global North. So I chose to focus on the informal aspects of the creative city, engaging with the work of grassroots cultural organizations. So after my preliminary fieldwork that I conducted last year for a few months, based on a snowball technique, I was mainly using interviews. I've selected three types of what can be called informal culture, that is independent, non-for-profit, non-governmental organizations. And these are among the main organizations in the field. So I've selected two arts factories. One is IMPA, the one I told you about at the beginning, which is this one. Sorry, this is IMPA, and then this is Fábrica Berin in Brazil. I've also selected two main artist movements which have emerged in the last years, and they're really visible in today's cultural scene in these two cities. One is MECA in Buenos Aires, which is a movement that concentrates independent cultural centers and spaces, many of which have been closed down by the municipal government on health and safety grounds. And in Rio de Janeiro, I'm looking at Ocupalapa, which is also sort of an arts collective movement that emerged to reclaim public space, particularly in the context of the militarization of space in Rio de Janeiro and the police intervention of many public spaces in the city. And finally, I'm looking at two social circus organizations, one in Buenos Aires and one in Rio. And yes, Chris, this speaks to my previous past as a trapeze artist. So I kind of know from my experience circulating in the underground world of circus, social circus, that they are really making up the city's creativity informally from below, based on collaboration with no resources, and they are doing amazing things that actually reshape the urban infrastructure of the city in very creative ways. So far I've undertaken fieldwork in Rio de Janeiro for almost 3 months, and in Buenos Aires for a month and a half. I've done approximately 45 in-depth interviews, semi-structured in-depth interviews with policymakers in the cultural and the creative sector at different levels, municipal, state and national, industry organizations, some banks, and cultural practitioners, artists and independent cultural centers. Then I also participated in a number of meetings, cultural policy meetings. In some of them I assisted as a part of the audience. In others I was helping to curate the content of these cultural policy meetings, really advocating for an inclusion of the informality sector and looking at the grassroots and inviting artists to actually have a voice in creative city discussions. So the analysis of some of the interviews has been conducted so far using thematic coding and based on interpretation, reflection, and the themes that began to emerge. And I'm also conducting content analysis of some key policy documents surrounding this idea of creative cities. So I'm looking also at the material transformation. How are these spaces being transformed informally through culture and creativity? And also the links with formal institutions. For instance, in both cases, we see that there are links with mainstream cultural organizations. So in the case of Berin, for instance, it has become part of Rio de Janeiro's Arts Festival, which is a widely advertised event in Rio. And in the case of IMPA, we see that the factory became part of the Buenos Aires Museum Nights, sponsored by the local government, which is the government that is actually trying to close down the informal cultural center. So this is all a very contradictory process where the informal and the formal are intermingled. It's difficult to draw clear-cut boundaries between these spheres. So now I'd like to share with you some preliminary findings and some conclusions. So what is a creative city again? How is it imagined, planned, and contested in a Latin American context? So the creative city field is emerging in these cities, in both cities, in Buenos Aires and in Rio, side by side grassroots local cultural disputes that unsettle the creative city policy imagination based on global aspirations. It is also emerging in the field in a context of urban transformations, aided by international festivals and mega sports events. The field is also being co-produced, not so much with arts and cultural organizations, but rather through an alliance between state power, private capital, and mega events and festivals. The field of the creative city also emerges in a context of social discontent and struggles over public space, cultural policies, and the future of the city. And I think that we can't really think of the creative city development in these two cities as something separate from the existing disputes that are taking place locally in the cultural sector. And mainly they are emerging following foreign models, mainly the UK, and international organizations' discourses such as UNCTAD and UNESCO, which came to be repetitively mentioned during my interviews. All of the policy interviewees I talked to were very aware of the work of Florida, Charles Landry. The UK has been sort of pioneering in the field and sort of legitimizing and justifying what they were doing in line with the international organizations sort of framework. So what are my emerging findings? So far I've identified one main thing, that is the emergence of two main creative city models. So the creative city emerges as an official construct, but also as a grassroots development. So if we look at the uses of creativity in these two preliminary models of creative city, we see that creativity is being mobilized as a product in the first case, as an economic and urban resource. And it's mainly based on the creative economy, however it is defined, on the events, on the flagship cultural developments, and on urban renewal operations. And they are really taken for granted. So being creative has become, as Andy has put it, as a policy mantra, and it is not being contested, it's simply being followed in a way. While the creative city as a grassroots development is becoming, is using creativity as a social process. It's really stressing, the social production of creativity, not its reduction to an economic commodity. So therefore, it's inseparable from cultural and artistic production. And it's based on solidarity, it's based on forms of social economies, informal economies in the creative sector. So who makes these cities? Who makes this form of creative city? In the first case, entrepreneurs, politicians, and large companies, mainly in the areas I mentioned already, and through policy, formal policy strategies. While in the other model of the creative city, we have artists and cultural workers, precarious conditions of production, informal disorganized practices, which are starting to be organized through these movements that I mentioned earlier, these arts collectives movements. So informality emerges in the first case as a concern towards formalization, although it remains widely invisible in policy accounts. While informality in this other model, grassroots model of the creative city, becomes an everyday way of life and work. Cultural policies in the first case are coupled with tourism goals, capital projects, and flagship developments. On the other case, it becomes a central object of contestation over public budget, the commodity logic, and the need to prioritize the local, as my interviewees put it. So what is the logic of development of these creative city different models? Well, in the first case, as I mentioned already, there seems to be an alliance between state power and private businesses, which give forms to spectacular liminal urbanism. So certain parts and certain moments of the city get to be visible, are rendered visible. While in the other case, we have culture really functioning as a social tool for transformation, giving way to democratic placemaking and city making. So what are the urban imaginaries being produced through these two models? Oops, sorry, I skipped one. So the creative city appears as a city of the future. If we look at the temporality of the creative city, it's not a city of the past, it's a city of the future. And this idea of transforming the city, that's the pathway that the city needs to follow, is always present in my interview accounts. So this emerges as an enterprise city, as with artists and creativity-led urban gentrification processes and the erasure of the commodification of the past of specific urban spaces. While in the other case, in the grassroots creative city, I think that the type of city that is imagined is one that reclaims the history of place. It's a city that seeks to develop forms of inclusive urban transformation. So based on these very preliminary findings, I want to share some conclusions in the next 10 minutes I have.
10 minutes.
Okay. So these two models in practice, of course, are interwoven. For instance, with grassroots cultural workers becoming part of formal initiatives, or the municipal government engaging them informally. Creative cities, the creative cities paradigm in Latin America has been received with suspicion, specifically fearing the subordination of the state's role to market forces. So we have a creative city imaginary which is entangled in discussions about infrastructure, international events, and political corruption, mainly in the case of Brazil. So we need to really unpack the northern model of the creative city because, of course, there are multiple and alternative models available. So creative city discourses anchored on the idea of the creative economy as a cure to the city's myriad problem as a fix fails to acknowledge the complicit role of creativity rhetoric in paving the way for neoliberal urban policies. And I want to argue that a focus on informality, therefore, challenges the relevance of previous thinking about creative cities, and it emerges as new lenses for understanding and developing these cities in the global south. So what's next? As I mentioned, I'm going to engage in a second round of fieldwork later in this year. I need to conduct further interviews with policymakers and cultural practitioners, mainly in Buenos Aires. I will be trying to develop, together with some of these cultural organizations, the artist movements, a survey, an online survey on independent cultural venues in the city, particularly in Buenos Aires, because this has been a great topic of debate and contestation, as I mentioned earlier, with the local government closing down most of these centers. So unfortunately, it reached to the legislature level where an initial law has been passed to actually recognize that there's a need for a new legal category to, to acknowledge the existence, the very existence of these places, which are not, which can really fit within any existing other categories within cultural legislation. And I'll be also looking at conducting some content analysis of newspaper articles about how they emerge in branding the cities, these two cities, as creative. So I'll finish my data analysis, I'll be writing up, and in terms of dissemination, I'm engaging in a number of activities that, they are going out beyond academia and also across different disciplines. Next week, we're going to have a Culture in the Informal City expert studio that I'm co-organizing with UCL's initiative on city leadership. This is going to take place in City University in London. The following day, I've organized a public lecture with Professor Nestor Garcia Canclini, a renowned cultural studies expert in Latin America, looking at this question of informal creativity. And next year, I plan to organize an international seminar on cultural policies at City University. So later in this year, my plan is also to set up knowledge exchange workshops, one in Buenos Aires and one in Rio, and really use this as an experiment to generate new forms of knowledge that hopefully can bring together, can bridge the gap between policy and practice in a way. I know this is challenging, but I'm going to give it a go. And finally, journal articles. I'm writing a couple of articles at the moment. I have one piece just published, it's just about to be published for City, Culture and Society journal. I'm in the process of resubmitting an article to Urban Studies. I'm also trying to finish translating my PhD thesis into Spanish to publish it in Argentina as a book. And I also planning to co-edit a special issue on culture and informality with UCL. And also another one on Southern creative cities, looking at not only Latin America, but also Asia and Africa. And I think with this I finished. Thank you very much.